Agriculture Minister Didiza has been advocating for the support of farmers in developing countries. However, the World Trade Organization's member countries could not agree on ways to regulate agricultural trade. Now, Didiza has been attending the WTO's 12th Ministerial Conference in Switzerland, and she joins me now live from Geneva virtually. Minister, thank you so much for your time this evening. You were able to address the gathering, and you used that platform to advocate for resource-poor farmers at these talks. Why was it important for you, before we get into the nitty-gritty of some of the other things that have come up in the conference, why was it important for you to use that platform to address this issue?
Well, it was important because the text that was on the table...
Minister, unfortunately, you're on mute. If you could just unmute yourself. Oh, sorry. Please do go ahead. Please do go ahead. I can hear you now.
Thank you very much. The reason we advocated for resource-poor farmers and smallholder farmers is because they are very critical in terms of providing food security at household level. And therefore, it is important that in the way in which they are supported, there is scope for countries to support that category of farmers, and therefore there must be space that is allowed. The reason we made that point, it's because in the earlier ministerial conferences, particularly when you look at the agreement on agriculture, which is the clause on 6.2, this is actually provided for. However, in the text that was up for negotiation and discussion, there was no reference to that, which we felt it was a mistake, and we needed to assert that so that South Africa, among other developing countries, are able to support the developing of farmers, particularly our resource-poor farmers, to be able to produce.
Now, funnily enough, in terms of timing, just last night I spoke to Professor Ruth Hall from the Institute for Poverty, Land and Agrarian Studies, PLAS at UWC. I'm sure you're very familiar with their work, and they've just released research that they've done over a year that looks at the impacts of COVID-19 responses on the political economy of African food systems. And I'm sure they would welcome the comments that you made at the WTO and saying, great that you're showing love in that regard, but it's also a message we need to bring back home in terms of how we look after our small and subsistence farmers.
Precisely. It is very important because most of the time when countries look at their food systems and how they operate, and in countries like ours, because of the duality of our agricultural sector, there may be a tendency to look at large commercial farmers as the bedrock for providing food security at national level, which is important. However, we cannot underplay the importance of smallholder farmers and subsistence farmers, particularly in the rural communities, because they not only provide food for household level, but they can actually get into the food value chain by making sure that they are able to sell at local level and get needed income to provide for other needs that they have as communities.
Now, news coming out of that conference was that the WTO's Director General approved an extension of a day, an extension of negotiations, because there were some important issues that needed to be discussed even further, and really wanted to try and get the member states to try and find each other. Can you let us in on what of those issues were that perhaps created a bit of a stalemate?
Well, let me just say that if you look at the negotiations that we're having, there were actually key areas for discussion, one being agriculture, the other one being the role of WTO in actually contributing towards food security, particularly when we look at the current conjuncture where we're coming out of COVID, but also the impact of the Ukraine-Russia conflict, which has actually created stress in a number of countries. So how does WTO, as a rules-based organization in terms of regulating trade, also appreciate that there might be a need for certain relaxation on trade regimes to assist in this context? Secondly, it was also the issue of a World Food Program, how it could also be assisted in terms of removing some of the constraints on exports, as well as sourcing from public stock holdings, such that those are appreciated that it is necessary to allow during this time of crisis. The other issue, obviously, was the response of WTO in terms of the COVID pandemic. You would recall that South Africa and India were ones that proposed for the waiver of patents by those who are the patent holders to allow for our companies in our national borders, but even in the continent, to be able to produce COVID vaccine. The other element related to the WTO reform. And another issue that we were looking at was the issue on fisheries, particularly how we could protect overfishing and unregulated fishing in the shores. The other was about e-commerce. So all of these areas were actually very important for us to find a way forward. And that's why there was a necessity for adding another day.
Now, those outside of the conference, there were protests outside of where your conference is taking place, civil society organizations protesting, and many of them saying that they speak on behalf of peasant and fisherfolk activists. They say they speak on behalf of the people of the global south, specifically saying that actually the WTO is the issue when it comes to agriculture and the fishing sector as well. And that as long as the WTO has a core role in setting up these trade routes, in setting up or has money to be made out of the various food systems, that people will never get ahead, and we won't see a break of some kind in the massive amounts of people still living under the poverty line across the world, even more so after the pandemic. What is your view on the role of the WTO? Do you really believe that working within its confines will get us to the point of changing this very set food system that very much leans towards those richer countries that you were trying to make a point against earlier at the conference?
For me, and I'm sure for South Africa and other governments, having a rules-based system is important, particularly at a multilateral level. And therefore, there is a role for WTO. If we need to improve, that is why even the trade ministers, who were mainly the heads of delegations, again emphasized the importance of reforming the institution. That is why it was on the agenda, so that we can, looking at the context and lived experience, what are those things that we need to improve? It's also important for me to indicate the role of civil society, because they are important in also giving their contributions in terms of what they think ought to happen, because indeed they are an important stakeholder. They represent a number of citizens across the globe. Ourselves in South Africa, as we went into these negotiations, we had a consultation with the social partners at NETLEC so that they can actually appreciate the stance that their government is taking. And I must say that we had a very good consultation, and they gave us support on the direction that we're taking in the negotiations.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much. Agriculture Minister Didiza speaking to us live there from Geneva, where she's attending the WTO 12th Ministerial Conference. We thank her for her time this evening.